Hello everybody, TYAN here, management there. This is Stef from Samayas and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to go in deep into the remote management IPMI capabilities of the TYAN GT86C-B5630. This video is a continuation on my previous in-depth review of this TYAN server. So let's dig in. So now let's dig into the IPMI interface of my TYAN GT86C-B5630. I have already located the IP address by looking to my firewall DHCP settings, and I've assigned a DNS name to the admin interface. Upon first connecting, of course the certificate does not correspond to my DNS name, so I receive a warning. If I look at my assigned certificate, the common name is Amy. So let's accept, and I receive a username and password. The default username is root, and the default password is superuser. So let's log in. And so here we end up in a slick, pretty modern IPMI interface. Compared to the Dell 13 Gen, this is much more modern. On my overview screen, I first have information about the device. My device is on. I have the firmware version. I have my firmware date. I have my BIOS version. And I have some network information about the IPMI interface. On the left, I have all different menus, which we'll dig into in detail. And on the top, I see I'm connected as user. I can change those. I can do a refresh. I can do sync. I have some warnings and some messages. Now let's first have a look at our maintenance and see if we can upgrade any of the firmwares. So at first sight, in the maintenance tab, we have backup configuration, we have the firmware location, firmware information, BIOS information, firmware update, preserve configuration, restart configuration, and restore to default. So let's first have a look at the backup. In here we can choose what we want to backup, KVM settings, network and server settings, IPMI settings, NTP settings, authentication settings, and syslog configuration. So let's click on download. And after having downloaded the configuration, I have a backup file, which is just a text file, where all settings are set in one by one. Let's look for password. There's no password clear text encoded. User password is $encrypted, which is not the password, so it's not omitting any secrets, which is good. And probably this way we can completely reset a configuration or share configurations between different systems of the same type. Now let's have a look at firmware image location. So next we have the screen firmware image location. And here we have two options. We have the web upload during flash, or we have a TFTP server. If we use the TFTP server, we need to have an active TFTP server locally, where we need to specify its IP address or hostname. We need to specify the location of where we might have an image and the retry count. If we use web upload, well, at first sight, I thought it implied that it was going to look itself to the site of TYAN and download it. But that's not at all the case. If we go to the firmware update settings and we're in web, we still need to press the browse button and manually provide the file we want to upload. If we put it in TFTP server mode and save, and then go to the firmware version, we can just press start and it will try to contact the TFTP server. And at the top we clearly see it will be using a TFTP protocol on a specific IP address and it will be looking for a name. Now, if you have multiple servers, you probably have or can set up temporarily a TFTP server and update each of those images. Also, in the firmware menu, we have a choice between updating our BMC firmware or our flash BIOS firmware. Now let's go back to the firmware information. And here, from my point of view, it gets a bit trickier. If we go back to the dashboard, I come to the conclusion that my BIOS firmware is in version 7.2.15, while my BMC firmware is in 2.05, but it's not really clear. So now when I surf to tyan.com, I get redirected to Metak Computing. And here I have 5 drivers available for BIOS, starting at V1 till V2.2. However, if I go back to my TYAN, well, I either have a BIOS version of V7.2.15 B80 or v205, which seems to be more recent and not available on the website. If I go to my BNC version, well, the most recent seem to be v6. If I go back to my TYAN, either this is v7, or if I go back to firmware information, it's v205. Then again, there's quite confusion between the version of this system and the versions available. So I won't try to update to something more recent and brick my system. I'll just leave it at that. We've already seen the firmware update. Now let's look at preserve configuration. Now the preserve configuration allows me to preserve part of the configuration upon a firmware update or upon a factory reset. For a factory reset, that makes sense. However, I don't see why for a firmware update I would have to lose my configuration. And especially if we have dozens and dozens of these servers, that can be tricky. So the next step is to restore a configuration we previously saved and or tweaked, or restore a configuration based on initial configuration and then reconfigure a dozen of other servers. And finally we have the factory reset, where we can choose which domain we want to reset. Now let's have a look at the sensor part. And that's a quite easy block. We have no critical errors. I only have a PSU status detected. I have no critical errors on any of my CPU or the memory. And I can see the CPU temperature, system temperature, motherboard temperature, etc. I can see my DIMM temperatures. I can see the system fan speeds. I can see the power drain in and out. I can see my PSU voltages. And I can see a number of other voltages. I even have small statistics for certain things. So somehow the small statistics which are shown here, when we click through, they're not shown. Next, when we click on the system inventory, we have an overview of the system. First we have the installed CPU, then we have the memory DIMMs installed. The system comes with 4 16GB DDR4 2133 MHz versions, and there's a RAID card and there's a network card. Even though there's only one normal PCIe slot in which I put a PERC, the network card is still considered a PCIe device. Next off, we have our field replaceable unit, or FRUs. When we select the first one, we have information about the board, the chassis information, the board construction and manufacturing date, etc. When we switch to the second one, or the first one, we have information about the PSU, just basic information, versioning, etc. Next off, we have the logs and reports, and under there, the first is the IPMI event log. In here we can filter by date, and we can filter by events. Depending on that, your list will change, and we can also filter on sensors specifically or not, or on all sensors. And finally we can click on the download button, and it'll download a file, or we can clear the events. And the second block is the video log. It's a feature of the BMC that allows to capture screen frames or snapshots of the host console when certain events occur. This might typically happen when your system crashes because of blue screen of death, and then the BMC will automatically take an image of what was displayed. This might also happen on post errors, like memory issues or BIOS error codes. And then finally, you can trigger it manually. So instead of just having a message like system is halted, you can later go into the video log and actually see what the console was showing when the error occurred. This might be very helpful. Next off, we have the settings, and here we have quite a number of options. First we have the date and time, and if we click through, based on the map, we can choose on which region we are located, and then we can specify 2 specific NTP servers, and we can choose to automatically configure date and time. The second block is the external user service, which allows us to configure external users to authenticate and access our IPMI on one or multiple TYAN servers. If you only have one, that doesn't really make much sense. If you have dozens, it's easier to set up either an LDAP or an Active Directory or Radius server and to manage the users who have access in a remote admin rather than do it server by server. First we have the LDAP directory settings, and under there we have either general and then role groups. If we click to general, we have to enable it. Then we need to specify the LDAP server, IP address or DNS name, port which is used to, the binding which you want to use. Technically an LDAP and an Active Directory could be the same, the password to connect to the LDAP server, the search base, and whether or not we want to search on CN or UID. And then finally, we can connect to the LDAP without any authentication, or with SSL, or with Start TLS. If you choose to Start TLS, we also need to provide a certificate root, certificate, and a private key. The second block, once we have configured the LDAP settings, is to specify the routes. Of course, I get an error since I haven't specified any LDAP server. Second, we have an Active Directory settings. Here again, we need to specify the Active Directory name. Once we're in the Active Directory settings, we need to enable it. We need to specify the account onto which it connects, the password used, the domain to connect to, and one or more domain controllers. And once we have configured that, again, we need to specify the roles which are allowed. I get an error again, since I have not configured Active Directory. And finally, we have radius settings. And instead of specifying Active Directory or an LDAP, we just specify a radius server, the port, and the secret. And finally, we enable the radius authentication. We specify the server address, port, and the secret. And we can choose to enable either just the KVM or also the virtual media access. Once we have configured the radius server, in the advanced radius, we have quite some different options then from Active Directory and LDAP. Here we need to specify administrator role, operator role, user role, or who doesn't have any access. Next we have the KVM mouse settings. If you want to install Linux, we'd rather have it in relative positioning. If you want to install Windows, it's better to have it in absolute positioning. And if we want to install SUSE Linux, we'd better have the third option. I'll choose Linux and save. Next we have log settings. Under log settings policy, we can choose to have a linear or a circular. Now when we put it into linear storage, all logs are written until the logs are full. Once the logs are full, nothing new will be written until somebody clears it. If we're in circular storage and we have a lot of errors, previous errors will be lost, but the latest error will still be written. So a good idea might be circular logging and then to keep an eye on the logs. And then under advanced logging, we can enable system log error. When this is enabled, active login and logout attempts are logged, configuration changes are logged, firmware update changes are logged, and service status changes are logged. And finally, we can choose the size of the log file we want to go. We can log it locally, or we can log it to remote server. If you're in enterprise setting, using remote server centralize, which regroups everything from every server, is a good idea. Next, we have the media redirection settings. First, we have the virtual instance settings. So this server, through remote management, allows you to map virtual media, which means that you can reinstall or install a server completely from a distance from this website. And even though you need an ISO, CD, USB or something, you don't need to physically go to the machine and you can do everything over the network. Of course, if you're on the side of the world and you have slower network connection, installing a new Ubuntu or something else or Windows on this machine will take a lot more time. So depending on the settings here, we can choose a number of instances that the virtual media will present to your server when you try to install. For instance, you want 0, 1 or 4 floppy disks, you want 1 or more CD-ROMs, or you want 1 or more hard disks. I think these days, unless you really install something very old, floppy disks is not really required anymore. If you want to install something in general, you'll be using a CD or DVD, or in some specific cases, a hard disk instance. Depending on if you're local or on a non-secure network connection, you might require encrypting the media redirection packets or not. And we just save the settings. And the second block, remote sessions. Under this, you can specify the keyboard you want out of the box. You can specify the retry count in case of issues and the timeout interval. Next off, we have network settings. And in the network settings, we have quite a few options. First, we have the network IP settings, then we have the network link settings, then DNS settings, and finally the sideband interface. Let's go to network IP settings. First of all, we can choose to enable or disable it. If I disable it, I won't have any access anymore whatsoever to this IPMI interface. Now my device, it has an IPMI Ethernet adapter, and it also has 2 SFP+ adapters. However, if I click in the LAN interface, I have Ethernet 0 and Ethernet 1. Ethernet 0 is a dedicated IPMI interface. Ethernet 1 is the shared SFP+1 port. There might be scenarios where you only have one Ethernet connection and you want to have your normal traffic on SFP1 and you want to have your IPMI connection on a VLAN of the same port. And by switching to Ethernet 1, the IPMI will be reconfigured and will be using the SFP+ port instead of the dedicated Ethernet port. We can enable IPv4 or enable IPv6. In my scenario, I leave it in IPv4. We can hardcode the IP address, or we can enable DHCP settings. Same thing for IPv6. We can hardcode it or enable the DHCP settings. And then finally, we can enable or not the VLAN settings, if we're in a scenario where we need VLAN. Next, we have the network link configuration. I'm configured on Ethernet 0, I'm in a full duplex gigabit connection, and I can do the same thing for Ethernet 1 and put it in auto negotiate or not. I won't change the setting. Next, we have the DNS configuration. If you have a totally isolated server which is not communicating to anything in the outside world, technically we don't even need DNS. However, if this server is part in an enterprise environment where it's using LDAP or Radius or Active Directory or a syslog server, instead of configuring IP addresses, we'll configure DNS names. And so we need to look up the IP address based on a DNS name. And so if something changes in your infrastructure, you don't need to rechange this IPMI configuration. MDNS stands for Multicast DNS, and instead of requiring a physical DNS server, it just tries to resolve IP addresses locally, like bonjour or giroconfig. And then next, we can specify the host name of the system. Out of the box, it's called AMI with something with a MAC address at the end, or we can just put it manually and I can configure it to the host name which I've named on top. Next, I can choose to register this DNS name somewhere on the host. I will have testnas.admin. And if we're using NSUpdate, it'll try to directly connect to DNS server and update the IP address it received to the host name and the DNS name. If we use DHCP client, full qualified name, it'll connect to DHCP server and the DHCP server itself will connect to the Active Directory and update the DNS server. Or we could just use the host name. In my scenario, I don't need it. And again, depending on the Ethernet interface, we can choose Ethernet 0 or Ethernet 1. The TSIG configuration. TSIG stands for Transaction Signature. It's a cryptographic mechanism and is used to authenticate this machine to a DNS server, so that not everybody can update DNS settings and or falsify them. Next we have the DNS settings. If it's an automatic, based on its DHCP server, it'll try to determine the DNS name. If it isn't, we can specify something manually. Same thing with the DNS server settings. It either receives it from Ethernet 0 or Ethernet 1, or we can manually specify the DNS server. And then finally, we can specify the IP priority, whether or not IPv4 or IPv6 is more priority. The sideband interface is what I've explained before. Instead of using a dedicated NIC, by using this, I can specify the Ethernet adapter to use instead of my normal dedicated IPMI network. It can be either configured in manual switching mode, or I can implement an automatic failover mode. NCSI interface allows me to specify the Ethernet adapter to use. The channel number and the package ID number currently only have value 0, and I can't really change anything about this. Next, we have the pluggable authentication module or PAM order settings. In here, we can specify which authentication happens first. In the current situation, it will first check against the local IPMI directory. If it doesn't find it, it'll go to LDAP if it's configured. If it doesn't find it, it'll go to Active Directory if it's configured. And if it doesn't find it, it'll go to Radius if it's configured. And then finally, it fails. If for whatever reason you're using LDAP, Active Directory or Radius, you might want to put those first, since you want to authenticate remotely. Since I'm all using IPMI, I leave it as is. So the platform event filter is a comprehensive event monitoring and alerting system that allows administrators to configure automated responses to hardware and system events. We first have event filters, then we have alert policies, and finally we have LAN destinations. In the event filters, we have a number of pre-configured events, containing roughly 40 predefined events. Each of those filters can be enabled or disabled, and those events include settings like event severity, sensor types, and trigger configurations. Now each of these event filters can be enabled or disabled. We can choose any severity, we can choose new monitoring state, we can choose new information, we can choose normal monitoring state, we can choose non-critical state, critical state, or non-recoverable state. We can choose the power action to none, power down, power cycle, or to reset. And we can choose an alert group number from 1 till 15. The raw data parameters allows us to configure generic IDs, channel numbers, sensor types, and event. And so you have a possibility to configure 40 different types depending on an issue: all events, specific sensor events, temperature events, fan events, power supply, etc. Should something happen, you can specify an event to be filtered on. Once you have specified an event, you can specify an alert policy. And here again, we have a number of predefined alert policy groups. which you can configure. And then finally we have the destinations. And here we have 15 LAN destinations based on the previous alert policies, which can trigger an SNMP trap or send out an email based on how we configure it. So the combination of those three allows us to monitoring our system on temperature, on power issues, etc. And for each of those categories specify an alert, and based on those alerts specify to trigger different SNMP traps or send out different mails. Next we have services, and those are the basic services which are running on the IPMI. We have the web service, which is running both on port 80 and 443. We have the KVM service, which is running on 7578 and 7582. We have CD media service to share media, which is running on 5120 and 5124. We have the floppy disk media, which is running on 5122 and 5126. We have the hard disk media, which is running on 5123 and 5127. We have the SSH, which is running on port 22. And we have Telnet, which is running on port 23. If you go on to view, we can see the number of active connections, and we can kill them if necessary. And we can, for each of those services, edit the settings. We can choose the interface, we can choose the non-secure, the secure port, we can choose the timeout, and we can enable or disable the service. So out of the box, SSH and Telnet were disabled. I've temporarily enabled them, and I'll see what I can do with them. Next we have the SMTP settings. This is used for the platform event filtering to send out warnings. Again, we need to choose the Ethernet interface, we need to specify the sender, and we need to specify the primary server mail name, the IP address, the port, whether or not we need to authenticate, whether or not we need to use SSL TLS, start TLS, and then we just save. So next we have the SSL settings, and first we have the view certificate, where we can see the certificate, which is uploaded. Next we have a generate SSL certificate, where we could create a certificate request, and then upload that certificate request to provider. And then finally we have an update SSL certificate, and if we provide certificate with a PEM, and a private key with a PEM, then it'll upload your own certificate to the IPMI. Something which is very important to achieve this is, first of all, the certificate must start with begin certificate, end certificate. However, the file names are also important, and I need to have a PEM extension for both. Next we have a system firewall, and underneath we have three blocks. We have general firewall settings, we have IP address firewall rules, and we have port firewall rules. Under general firewall settings, we have existing firewall settings, and we can add new settings. Since I haven't configured anything yet, our existing settings are empty. I can add new firewall settings, and so in here we can block all IPv4, all IPv6, or both. This is more like something which is an emergency, where you put a start date, a start time, an end date, an end time. If you don't put an end time, I don't know how you will ever regain access to the IPMI other than doing full reset. Now let's create a block on IPv6, since we're not using IPv6, and we do it for tomorrow, just to see what it gives. And let's say, so I have created a block all on IPv6. Let's now go back to firewall settings, and I have a block all for tomorrow. And here I can remove it just by clicking delete, and it's gone again. If I look at the IP firewall rules, again, I have existing IP firewall rules, or I can add a new. I have no existing at this time, so it's empty. And if I add a new firewall rule, I could specify that everything which is in my local range has access to this machine. And I could specify a start and end date, and I can specify whether I want to allow this range or whether I want to block this range. For this kind of simple rules, the most obvious thing is to allow a specific range instead of specifying a block range. Now, if you're in a more complex scenario with this firewall, so now let's click save, and if I go back to existing rules, I can see the specific rule that those ranges can access. An existing rule, I can again delete it, and then finally I have port firewall rules. Here again, I have existing rules, nothing is there, and I can create a rule. Let's say for instance that port 443, which is SSL, can be accessed on IPv4 and is allowed. Now if I go back to my existing rules, I can see I have an allow on port 443. Now even though I have some firewall rules, it's very basic and there's no possibility to make a combination between IP and port. So it can be useful in very specific scenarios, but if you need something more complex, well, this won't help it. Now in general, an interface like that is never directly on the internet. As a final test, I try a combination of both. First, I have a port firewall rule that allows all traffic on port 443. Next, I have an IP firewall rule that allows all traffic in the range 192.168.150/24. Both are without time restriction. Now finally, I'm gonna make a general block on IPv4 for today for the next 5 minutes. And so if everything is combined, I should still be able to access my TYAN. So even though I block all my traffic, my specific range for a specific port should still be possible. So let's give it a shot. I saved it. Well, unfortunately, it's not the case. I have no access whatsoever anymore. So my little experiment with the firewall rule locked me out completely. Whatever I tried, it completely ignored the times I entered. I tried changing the BIOS time to +2 years, still nothing. I went through the BIOS settings to find anything possible to reset, and it did not find any possibility to do the factory reset of my TYAN BMC. So that means that if you really fuck up, I have no idea how to reset it. So how then did I still get access? Well, when I started, I described I only had an IPv4. In the end, I assigned a fixed IPv6 address to my TYAN server. I created a second DNS entry, testnas2, to which I assigned the IPv6 address, and that allowed me access. Now, if we have a look at the rule which is created, and it's probably my error, I clearly created a rule with a begin and an end time. However, the rule it's created had no begin and end time. So let's delete this one. So the mistake I made, and basically from my point of view, that's a UI mistake, is I need to flag timeout and then start and end date. When you have a good UI, if timeout is disabled, those options on this dialog, even though timeout is not selected, I can select start date, start time, end date and end time. There are other dialogs where if you don't flag it, the depending text boxes are disabled. And so here for it to work, I need to enable timeout, I need to select the right date, and when I save now, and I go back, now the time is saved. Next we have user management, and currently the system has 2 users, anonymous, which is disabled, and a root, which is myself. If I click true, I could change the username, I could change the password, I can enable or disable, I can give administrative privileges, I can give user privileges, operator, or none. I can enable or disable serial privileges. I can specify 2 types of email formats. I have to specify an email address, and I can assign an SSH key to log in. Now if you want to use IPMI tools and would just stay local, it would be a good idea to create a specific user for that with specific rights just for the IPMI tool. We could do the same thing if you want to have SSH. And then finally we have the video recorder settings. We previously under log already had a video log. Well, here we can define the triggers. So we can specify if we have critical events like temperature or voltage, non-critical temperature or voltage, non-recoverable events, fan state change events, watchdog timer events, chassis open events, chassis power off, chassis reset, etc. And if we want to, and we want to log a lot, we could even use a remote NFS or KIF server to log all our videos. And there's even an option if you're using Red Hat. And finally, we can specify the quality of the video, quality of the compression, the number of frames, and duration. Duration goes from 10 seconds to 60 seconds. Frames goes from 1 per second to 4 per second. Compression goes from high to low to none. And video quality goes from very low to high. Next, we have the remote control. In here, we have 2 buttons, either launch KVM in HTML5 or launch KVM in Java. There used to be a time that everybody was running Java. These days, less and less, and I think that the only feasible option is HTML5. And so this launches a second viewer where you can see the screen of a computer. Currently, I put in a new disk, which is an old SSD from an old Windows. I have a number of options. I can pause the video, I can refresh, I can capture, I can show or not show the mouse, and I have the same option. I can switch to relative mouse, to absolute mouse, or to other mouse options. For SUSE Linux, under the options, I can block request. I can choose the quality from best quality to 4 to minimum quality. I can choose color schemes. Keyboard, I can choose my keyboard style, US, German, Japanese. I can send Ctrl-Alt-Delete. I have specific key combination if I need to. I can add hotkeys. I can record if I need to, and I can recycle through power on, power off, reset the server. So let's reset the server, and so as you see, he's recycling. I also have the same button here, which can power it on or off, Now it's powered off. Now I can power it on again. And if multiple users is there, I can see the different users. And then finally, after rebooting, I end up back in the BIOS. Now, if you look closely, there's only one thing missing to the HTML KVM. Have you seen a media button anywhere? If you compare it to the iDRAC, in general you have a media button and you can mount an ISO, a floppy or something else. Here, somehow it's absent. And according to Google and other sources, this is a known issue between the TYAN and the more modern browsers. Now, since most of the more modern browsers don't support Java anyway, there's only one solution. You still need to launch KVM Java, and that downloads a jviewer.gnpl. So let's double click on the jviewer GNLP. First it asks me if I want to launch it, then I get a warning if I want to continue, and then I still get a Java block. So I will have to tweak something anyhow. So according to Google, the quickest fix for this is to open the Java control panel, go to the security tab and enter my URL in the exception list. So let's give that a shot. Let's try again. And now I have a question asking me if I want to run it. I accept, and I still accept the supposedly untrusted application. And somehow, even though I have the media now, the media wizard just closes. So even the Java version doesn't seem to work. And the only way to really install will be to insert an USB stick. That's a bummer. And finally, I have the power control. If I don't want to use the remote control, I can still do actions like power off, power on, power recycle, which is an on and off, a hard reset, or an ACPI shutdown. So an ACPI shutdown gracefully shuts down your OS without crashing. And then I have a chassis identify. Since I have a 48U rack with 48 of those TYAN servers, if one of those break down, well, I need to identify which one exactly it is. That's why, as we've seen already on the previous presentation, we have a UID which can be activated. And here in the menu, I can put it off, I can put it on for 15 seconds, I can put it on for 60 seconds, or I can leave it on until I turn it later on back off. That allows me to go from my office all the way to the data floor, find the server, do the necessary things, and then afterwards turn it back off. And so first you can see it on in the front, and now you can see it on in the back. And then the final option we have is Set Front Panel Enabled, where we have two buttons. We have the local lock panel or the local unlock panel. Basically, if you lock it, the reset and power button won't work anymore, and if you unlock it, you can still power on or power off the device using the buttons. Now let's have a look at the open ports on the IPMI device. The first two, of course, are the HTTP and HTTPS port, and if we switch back to the server, indeed we have HTTP on port 80 and HTTPS on port 443. Next we have port 22 for SSH, and I have enabled port 22 for SSH. Then we have port 23 for Telnet, and I've enabled port 23 for Telnet. Out of the box, those are both disabled. Then we have port 623, and if you go back here, it isn't shown. A quick search on Google learns that port 623 is used for IPMI, and it could be used for server check, for remote configuring of a server, for virtual media, etc. Even though on this server, the virtual media like CD media, like floppy disk media and hard disk media are on other ports. Then we have port 5124, and 5124 is the CD media, 5126, and 5126 is the floppy disk media, 5127, and 5127 is the HD media. And the last open port we detected is 7582, and that's specifically for KVM. No other open ports were detected. So let's try to access our IPMI through Telnet and see what we can do. Username, password. Okay. Well, I seem to have a basic Linux prompt. And I seem to be able to do basic functionality and commands which are available. So now let's try to SSH into my IPMI host, and the first try doesn't work. So let's give it a second shot and let's specify the MAC to use and username. And now it accepts password. And again, we have the same thing as with Telnet, nothing special. And we can do exactly the same thing. So SSH works as well. And finally, let's have a look how resistant this TYAN IPMI console is if you want to brute force attack it. Normally after a couple of tries, you should have a delay, a timeout for 10, 20, 15, half an hour or more, or a lock. So let's give it a shot. There was nothing in the settings. So let's first try a random username and password, nothing. Now I know that admin isn't valid, so I cannot block anything. I do notice that after each refresh, I have less interaction if I just click on sign me on. I don't have the visual effect. However, I do see the post happening. And so for each retry, there's a post request happening. At least it's an HTTPS connection and it's a post request. That's a good thing. This concludes the in-depth review of the TYAN IPMI remote management capabilities. I'll also be doing a review on the TYAN BIOS settings in another video. If you guys like this content, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell sign. Or leave a comment down below.